On March the 16th, 1968, the quiet dawn in San Mai village was shattered by the arrival of American soldiers. In the hamlets of My Lai and My Key, the air soon filled with the sounds of an unfolding horror. The soldiers, tasked with rooting out Viet Cong sympathizers, turned their weapons on the unarmed, and a massacre ensued. Men, women, children, and infants fell before the guns and grenades. The brutality was unsparing, and the violence indiscriminate. By the end, over 500 people lay dead, the ground bearing silent witness to the atrocity. But what could justify the immediate transformation of protectors into perpetrators? This is the chilling tale of the My Lai Massacre. On the morning of March the 16th, 1968, at 7:30, approximately 100 soldiers of the American Charlie Company arrived in the vicinity of the My Lai village, which was also referred to as Pinkville. This was a routine occurrence for the villagers, who were accustomed to the presence of soldiers in their area. Many of them were in the midst of their morning meal when the soldiers approached. Unknown to the villagers, the soldiers had received strict orders from Captain Ernest Medina. Their mission was to destroy the entire village, including burning down the cabins, killing the animals, and poisoning the wells. The soldiers were instructed to consider anyone still in the village after 7 a.m. as either Viet Cong or sympathizers. Medina's orders were clear: crush everything that walks, crawls, or growls. This brutal directive left no room for exceptions. When questioned by the soldiers about whether the order included women and children, the response was chillingly callous. They are all VC now, go and get them. The scene was tense as the soldiers moved through the village, executing their orders with ruthless efficiency. The villagers, caught off guard by the sudden violence, had no chance to defend themselves. The soldiers showed no mercy, carrying out their mission without hesitation. The machine gun operator, Harry Stanley, recounted that the violence erupted suddenly and without warning. He observed a group of villagers gathering in the center when one of the soldiers viciously stabbed an elderly man with a bayonet. Shockingly, the same soldier then pushed another man into a well and detonated explosives, causing chaos and terror to spread throughout the village. As panic gripped the villagers, American soldiers indiscriminately opened fire, targeting anyone in their path. This brutality was carried out under the command of 2nd Lieutenant William Calley. Calley ordered about 80 Vietnamese individuals to assemble alongside the edge of a ditch, where they were ruthlessly shot in the back of the head. The horrors continued as approximately 20 women and children sought refuge in a small temple. Despite their pleas for mercy, their cries falling on deaf ears, the soldiers executed them one by one with shots to the head. The scene was one of unimaginable cruelty and despair, as innocent lives were mercilessly taken in a display of unchecked violence. During the trial, Private Paul Medlow recounted his actions in chilling detail. He described how he fired multiple rounds from his rifle at the villagers, following orders out of fear from Sergeant Kelly, who had previously physically assaulted him for disobedience. Medlow mentioned that amidst the chaos, the women in My Lai were pleading that they were not Viet Cong, trying desperately to shield their children from the gunfire. Medlow's memories were haunting. He recalled shooting at everyone, from elderly grandmothers to teenagers, some of whom were clutching babies and toddlers. He believed they were all potentially carrying hidden grenades, what he termed My Lai tray traps. Another soldier, Private Dennis Conti, testified that many women had thrown themselves over their children, attempting to protect them from the bullets. Tragically, those children who managed to stand were mercilessly gunned down by Calley and his men. Private Michael Bernhard recounted the horrors of the village being set ablaze by the soldiers, turning into a nightmarish inferno. As people fled from the flames, they were met with gunfire, adding to the massacre's brutality. Bernhard remembered seeing piles of bodies scattered throughout the village, with grenades being thrown at wounded survivors to ensure no one remained alive. The scene was one of senseless violence. Women and children were targeted without discrimination, despite the absence of any resistance or threat to the soldiers. The village, typical of many Vietnamese communities, had no men of military age present, either dead or alive. Charlie Company's role in the My Lai Massacre. During the massacre, not all soldiers from Charlie Company were involved. A later investigation found that out of 100 soldiers, only 33 took part in the horrific actions. However, those who didn't obey the orders didn't intervene to stop the brutality, allowing their comrades to act without restraint. One soldier, Private Herbert Carter, was strongly against participating. He went as far as deliberately injuring himself by shooting his own foot to avoid being part of the violence. Remarkably, this self-inflicted injury was the only one among American forces during the massacre. Despite not all soldiers being directly involved, Charlie Company didn't stop at just killing unarmed civilians. Some of them engaged in torture and mass rape before executing the villagers. The brutality extended to mutilating some of the victims' bodies. In a disturbing display of callousness, some villagers had the initials C Company carved into their chest after death, marking them with a grim signature of the unit's involvement in the atrocity. Private Venardo Simpson's journey into the military began at a remarkably young age of 18, as he enlisted in 1967. His path led him straight into the turbulent times of the Vietnam War, where he was deployed to the 2nd Division of Charlie Company. Like many of his comrades, Simpson was a youthful soul, surrounded by peers mostly in their late teens, early 20s, lacking substantial life experiences. In 1970, 2 years after the infamous massacre, Simpson found himself recounting the horrors of that dark period in a documentary. His voice, devoid of emotion, carried a distant tone as he shared the brutal realities of the atrocities committed in My Lai. He delved into the disturbing rationale behind some of the actions, reflecting a chilling detachment from the gravity of the events. One chilling aspect Simpson revealed was the warped logic instilled in the soldiers. They were led to believe that infants would grow up to be Viet Cong, thus justifying their inhumane actions toward them. The soldiers were also fed a narrative that the Vietnamese held strong religious beliefs, believing that mutilation would prevent the dead from reaching heaven. This twisted justification led to despicable acts of hanging, scalping, throat-cutting, and other forms of savagery, acts that Simpson disturbingly admitted were carried out with a sense of enjoyment by some. However, what Simpson omitted from the documentary was equally significant. It was his own participation in these heinous acts that he conveniently left out of the narrative. My Lai through Ronald Haberle's lens. On the day that would be marked by history as the My Lai Massacre, war photographer Ronald Haberle joined Charlie Company. It was a morning like no other, as he introduced himself to the soldiers, unaware of the horrors that would unfold. His photographs and personal account would later become a haunting narrative of the Vietnam War. As the operation commenced, Haberle's eyes met with a scene that seemed ordinary at first, civilians perhaps going about their day. But suddenly, the crack of gunfire shattered the calm. Soldiers began shooting at them. Haberle was stunned, unable to grasp the unfolding chaos. Yet, instinctively, he raised his camera. The images he captured that day would traverse the globe, igniting a fierce anti-war sentiment back in America. Among the photographs, one stood out, a shocking symbol of the tragedy. It depicted a crying grandmother, her arms wrapped around a young girl trying to offer solace. Behind them, an older woman, her head gruesomely wounded, reached out to comfort another child. To their side, a teenage girl struggled to cover herself after a brutal assault, clutching a toddler in her arms. These innocent lives, moments from being cruelly snatched away, became the face of the massacre. Haberle bore witness to unspeakable acts. He saw soldiers dehumanize their victims, stripping a young girl of her dignity, her mother desperately fighting to shield her. The photographer's plea for a brief pause to capture one last image of their existence was a futile attempt to humanize the condemned. The villagers' cries and prayers filled the air, a stark contrast to the soldiers' indifference. With the click of a shutter, Haberle turned away, unable to watch as life was extinguished before his lens. The rapid fire of machine guns followed, a grim punctuation to the atrocity. In mere moments where there had been life, there was now only silence. Haberle also told the heart-wrenching story of two young boys aged 4 and 5. The older boy, in a desperate act of protection, threw himself over the younger, trying to shield him from the bullets. Despite his courage, it was a futile gesture. Both lives were tragically lost. This act of violence was incomprehensible to Ronald Haberle, who believed American soldiers were there to safeguard, not harm. As Haberle witnessed the senseless killing of innocent villagers, his shock deepened. There were no enemy combatants, only defenseless peasants. Vietnamese authorities later reported that 504 unarmed civilians were mercilessly killed that day. The village of My Lai might have been erased entirely if not for the intervention of Hugh Thompson Jr., a 25-year-old helicopter pilot. Thompson, along with his crew members Lawrence Colburn and Glenn Andreatta, flew over My Lai, expecting to support a nearby battalion. Instead, they stumbled upon a scene of carnage, bodies strewn across the ground, wounded women and children crying out in pain. Initially mistaking the devastation for the aftermath of an artillery strike or bombing, they landed to offer aid. While Thompson was assisting a wounded woman, Captain Ernest Medina appeared. In a shocking turn, Medina executed the woman right before the eyes of the horrified pilots. This brutal act underscored the chaos and moral collapse that had engulfed the soldiers of Charlie Company. Hugh Thompson Jr., the hero of My Lai. The actions of Thompson and his crew that day stand in stark contrast to the brutality around them. They made a valiant effort to stop the massacre, confronting fellow soldiers and rescuing as many civilians as they could. Witnessing the actions of Captain Medina, we were struck by a chilling realization. The perpetrators of the violence were none other than our own comrades. Amidst the chaos, determined, Thompson reached for the helicopter radio, his voice heavy with indignation. There's a senseless amount of killing unfolding before us. It's a widespread tragedy. Not far from Thompson's position, a huddle of terrified civilians sought refuge in a bunker, their fates hanging by a thread. In that moment, Thompson faced a decision that defied belief, one that could have led him to face the ultimate penalty under military law. Yet he stood resolute, recognizing the horrors of the situation as American soldiers embarked on a ruthless rampage. Words had failed. It was time for decisive action. As Thompson witnessed soldiers closing in on a group of vulnerable women and children, he issued an unprecedented command to his crew: aim your weapon at our own forces. With a bold maneuver, he steered the helicopter to land between the advancing troops and the petrified villagers. Stepping out, he confronted a lieutenant on the ground. "These are human beings, unarmed civilians," he asserted, his voice firm despite the lieutenant's higher rank. Thompson issued a direct order demanding the lieutenant halt his men. With the support of larger helicopter gunships, Thompson and his crew embarked on a daring rescue, successfully evacuating over a dozen elderly individuals, women, and children to safety. It was a moment that showcased the profound courage and moral fortitude of a soldier willing to stand against the tide to protect the innocent at all costs. In a decisive act of defiance, Thompson conveyed an unmistakable ultimatum to American soldiers. Any further attempts to harm the Vietnamese would be met with resistance from his own crew. This bold declaration was the turning point that halted the My Lai Massacre. Calling upon the support of additional helicopters, Thompson orchestrated a mass evacuation, ferrying dozens of villagers to the safety of the skies. With a heart heavy with sorrow, Thompson and his fellow crew members traversed the grim landscape of mass graves, their eyes searching for any signs of life. It was imperative to put an end to this atrocity, Thompson later reflected on the grave warning he had issued. I believed it was the only way to restore sanity amidst the madness. Despite Thompson's immediate reports to his superiors and the detailed account he submitted to the military authorities, there was a concerted effort within the higher ranks to suppress the truth about My Lai. It wasn't until November of 1969 that the veil of secrecy was finally lifted. The media, armed with the harrowing images captured by photographer Ron Haberly, brought the grim reality of the massacre to light, sending shockwaves around the globe. Faced with undeniable evidence and public outcry, the U.S. government was compelled to initiate a formal investigation into the events that unfolded at My Lai. Justice denied and heroes forgotten. In the aftermath of the My Lai massacre, a mere 26 individuals were indicted, yet the charges against them were systematically dismissed or resulted in acquittals. Among those acquitted was Captain Ernest Medina, the commanding officer who not only ordered the annihilation of the village, but also participated in the atrocities. The majority of the accused denied any wrongdoing or expressed public contrition, justifying their actions by claiming adherence to orders. Lieutenant William Calley, however, stood as the sole person convicted for his role in the massacre, both for commanding the mass execution and for his direct involvement. During his trial, Calley expressed no remorse, stating, "I was commanded to eliminate the enemy. That was my assignment. I didn't pause to consider their humanity. They were all categorized as enemy combatants." Calley's life sentence in 1971 sparked outrage among governors and politicians, and he found widespread sympathy among the American public, many of whom viewed the punishment as excessively severe and Calley as a scapegoat. A survey revealed that up to 79% disagreed with the judgment. Shortly after the sentencing, President Nixon intervened, ordering Calley's release from prison to house arrest. Ultimately, Calley served a mere 3 years under these conditions. Contrastingly, helicopter pilot Hugh Thompson faced a starkly different reality. By threatening to fire upon his fellow soldiers to protect the Vietnamese civilians, revealing the massacre, and testifying against those involved, Thompson was branded a traitor by many in the military, political circles, and the public. He endured ostracization and threats, including disturbing encounters with deceased animals left at his doorstep. Haunted by the events he witnessed, Thompson battled with post-traumatic stress disorder, alcohol dependency, and persistent nightmares. It took 3 decades for his courageous actions to be formally recognized. In 1998, 30 years after the harrowing events of My Lai, Thompson and his 2 crew members were finally commended for their extraordinary acts of valor. The weight of war. Vernado Simpson's life took a tragic turn after his service in the Vietnam War. As a young 19-year-old soldier, he experienced events during the 4 hours in My Lai that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The aftermath of the war saw Simpson grappling with severe mental health issues, a struggle that led him in and out of hospitals as he tried to cope with the invisible wounds of war. Diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, Simpson found himself retreating from the world, spending countless years within the confines of his home, the curtains drawn to shield him from a reality he could no longer face. The memories of the massacre lingered, a heavy burden that he carried alone. In a candid revelation on a television show in 1989, Simpson shared the harrowing details of his actions during the massacre. He confessed to the killing of 20 to 25 people, detailing the horrific acts of violence he committed. This admission was not just a recounting of facts, it was an unburdening of a soul tormented by the past. Simpson's days were spent poring over a photo album filled with newspaper clippings and photographs of the massacre, a grim reminder of the lives he had taken. Among the faces he pointed out to a journalist were those of children, their innocence stolen by the chaos of war. When asked how he could bear to look at these images, his response was simple yet profound: "Because this is my life." Tragedy struck again in 1977 when Simpson's 10-year-old son was accidentally shot and killed. Holding his dying child in his arms, Simpson was confronted with a painful echo of the past. The young boy's face resembled that of a child Simpson had killed during the war, a stark reminder of the consequences of his actions. In that moment, Simpson believed he had received his punishment for the lives he had taken that fateful day in My Lai. In 1997, a tragic event unfolded as Simpson, overwhelmed by his circumstances, made the heartbreaking decision to end his own life. This act reverberated deeply, especially in light of the My Lai Massacre. The following year, in 1998, a memorial service was held at My Lai to honor those lost in the massacre. Surprisingly, none of those involved in the tragic event attended this solemn gathering. It's notable that even 30 years after the massacre, key figures like U.S. diplomats and other American officials were absent from the memorial. However, amidst this absence, there were individuals who stood out for their actions and remembrance. Pilot Hugh Thompson and soldier Lawrence Kern were among them. Despite the absence of official representatives, their presence spoke volumes about their commitment to honoring the memory of the victims. Tragedy struck again with the passing of Glenn Andrietta, a companion who played a role in halting the massacre. He was just 20 years old at the time of this heroic act. Amidst the somber remembrance, there were moments of connection and reunion. During the 30th anniversary, Thompson, who had rescued individuals during the massacre, was reunited with some of those he had helped save. This reunion brought a sense of closure and solidarity, highlighting the resilience and strength of those affected by the tragedy.